I watched my brother's face go completely still the moment the attorney said my name. Not nervous, not confused. Still, the way a person goes still when they realize, all at once, that they have already lost. He had spent the last 40 minutes telling a room full of people that I didn't belong there, that I had never contributed anything meaningful to the family business, that our father, before he died, had made it clear I was to receive a modest inheritance and step aside so the company could be run by someone who actually understood it. He said all of this with his hands folded on the conference table, completely calm, the way people are calm when they believe the outcome is already decided. I sat across from him and didn't say a single word. I should back up. My father built Callaway Freight out of nothing. I mean that literally. He started it with one truck, a lease on a small warehouse out in Cincinnati, and a reputation for never missing a delivery window. By the time I was 10 years old, the company had 12 trucks. By the time I graduated high school, it had a regional distribution contract with 3 major retailers. By the time my father died, Callaway Freight had 47 full-time employees, a fleet of 31 vehicles, and annual revenue that I will not quote here because my brother's attorney told him I didn't know the numbers. I knew the numbers. I had been doing the books unofficially since I was 19. My father didn't ask me to. I just started because I noticed one summer when I was home from college that the accounts receivable spreadsheet had an error that had been compounding for 8 months. I fixed it. My father looked at what I had done and didn't say much. He wasn't a man who said much. But the next week he gave me access to the full accounting software. That was his version of thank you. My brother Derek was 7 years older than me. He had worked in operations since he was 22. He knew the drivers by name, knew the routes, knew which clients were difficult and which ones would forgive a late delivery if you called them first. He was good at his job. I want to be fair about that. He was genuinely good at the operational side of running that company. What Derek was not good at was accepting that anyone else might also be good at something. When I was 23 and had just finished my MBA, I came back to Cincinnati and sat down with my father to talk about where I fit into the business going forward. My father was 61 at the time and starting to think about the next chapter. He wanted to formalize things. He wanted both of us involved. Derek found out about that conversation and called me the same night. Dad doesn't need 2 people running things, he said. It creates confusion. You know that. I wasn't suggesting I run things, I said. I was suggesting I work in finance, which is literally what I just spent 6 years training to do. The company has an accountant. The company has a bookkeeper who files quarterly taxes and doesn't understand our depreciation schedule. He was quiet for a moment. Dad will figure out what he needs. What my father figured out over the next 2 years was that he needed me handling the financial strategy while Derek handled operations. It worked. For a while, it actually worked well. We restructured 2 vendor contracts and saved the company close to $180,000 in the first year alone. I brought in a line of credit that let us expand into a new warehouse in Dayton. Derek grew the client base, the company grew, and then my father had a stroke. He survived it, but he was never fully the same after. His speech came back mostly, his mobility came back mostly, but the sharp edge of his attention, the thing that had made him so good at running a business, that didn't come back the same way. He started deferring to Derek on everything. I think it was partly cognitive and partly that Derek was physically there every day, and I had moved to Dayton to manage the new operation. Over the following 18 months, Derek started making decisions I was not consulted on. A new fleet lease I didn't know about until I saw the liability on the balance sheet. A severance agreement with our longest-tenured dispatcher that Derek negotiated himself poorly and which cost us more than it should have. Small things at first, then less small. When I tried to raise concerns, Derek would listen, nod, and then do exactly what he had already planned to do. When I went to my father would listen, nod, and say something like, "Derek knows the operations side, sweetheart. Let him handle it." I started keeping records, not because I thought I would ever need them. I just kept them the same way I kept everything, because I am the kind of person who does not let numbers float. My father died on a Tuesday in March 18 months ago, heart failure 7 years after the stroke. He was 69. I flew home from Dayton for the funeral. Derek stood next to me at the graveside and put his arm around my shoulders, and I let him, because that is what you do when you are standing at your father's grave, and you are trying to hold yourself together. 3 days after the funeral, Derek sat me down in my father's office. His office now, apparently, and told me that he had already spoken to the estate attorney and had a clear picture of what our father wanted. Dad left the business to both of us equally, I said. I had seen the will, I knew this. He left equity equally, Derek said, but he also left a letter of instruction making clear that operational control was to be mine. You were to take a payout for your share and step back. I asked to see the letter. Derek said the attorney had it. I said I wanted to see it before any decisions were made. Derek said he understood that, and that we would schedule a meeting. He did not schedule a meeting. For 6 weeks, I called the estate attorney, a man named Whitfield who had handled our family's legal affairs for 20 years, and got voicemails and vague responses from his assistant about scheduling. Derek, I later learned, had been meeting with Whitfield weekly during this time. I hired my own attorney. Her name was Janet Okafor, and she had been recommended to me by a woman I had gone to business school with who said, "If you need someone who will actually fight, call Janet." I called Janet. She reviewed the will, requested all estate documents, and told me, within 2 weeks, that the letter of instruction Derek had described did not have the legal standing Derek had implied. It was a personal letter, not a codicil. It expressed preference, not legal directive. Your brother is trying to get you to walk away from something you're legally entitled to, Janet told me. I know, I said. Do you want to fight it? Yes. What Janet didn't know yet, what I hadn't told her yet, was that there was more to the picture than my 50% stake in the company. Here's what I had been doing quietly for the previous 4 years. The Dayton warehouse expansion had required us to form a subsidiary LLC for tax and liability purposes. My father signed the paperwork. Derek wasn't involved in that structure because Derek didn't get involved in financial structures. I was the managing member of the subsidiary. I controlled its operating agreement. Over 4 years, the subsidiary had accumulated its own assets, equipment, leases, client contracts that ran through that entity rather than the parent company. The subsidiary's value was not reflected in the parent company valuation that Derek's team had prepared for the estate. Additionally, and this is the part that took me 3 years of careful, quiet work to accomplish, I had purchased a 34% stake in the property on which the main Cincinnati warehouse sat. The property was owned by a holding company that our family had never had direct contact with. Over several years, through a real estate investment account I had set up under my own name before my father died, I had bought out minority partners in that holding company one by one. The lease that Callaway Freight paid to operate out of that warehouse ran through an entity in which I now held a controlling interest. My father didn't know. I had not hidden this from him to deceive him. I had simply done it as a private investment, the same way I had a brokerage account and a 401(k) and a small rental property in Dayton that were all entirely my own. I had never commingled these assets with the company. I had never hidden them from the estate process. They simply had not come up yet because Derek had not allowed the estate process to move forward in any meaningful way. Janet's eyes went a little wide when I walked her through all of it. "You've been building this for how long?" she said. "Pieces of it for about 4 years, I said. "I didn't plan it as a strategy. I just don't let opportunities sit when I see them." She looked at me for a long moment. "Okay," she said, "then let's go." The mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in October. It was held in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Cincinnati, the kind of room with a long glass table and a view of the river and a credenza with coffee that nobody touched because everyone was too tense. Derek arrived with 2 attorneys and his CFO, a man he had hired 6 months after my father's stroke specifically to handle functions I used to handle. They had a bound presentation, they had projections. They had a valuation of the company that Derek's team had prepared, and that was, I noted, about 12% lower than the number I had independently calculated, in a way that happened to reduce the payout I would be owed if I accepted a buyout. Derek opened by laying out what he called the practical path forward. I would receive a buyout based on their valuation. I would sign a non-compete. I would exit the business. He framed this as honoring Dad's wishes and doing what's best for the company and the family. His lead attorney, a man with silver hair and a very expensive suit, reinforced each point with language about business continuity and operational stability. They talked for 40 minutes. When they finished, Derek leaned back and looked at me with the expression of someone who believes they have just closed a deal. I looked at Janet. She opened her folder. "We appreciate the presentation," she said. "We do have a few things to add to the picture." She started with the subsidiary LLC. She walked them through the assets, the client contracts, the operating agreement. Derek's CFO started taking rapid notes. Derek's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes. Then Janet walked them through the property holding company. She put a document on the table. It was a certified ownership summary from the holding company's registered agent, showing the current membership interests. Derek's lead attorney picked it up. He read it. He set it down. He read it again. "This is the property the warehouse sits on," Janet said pleasantly. "My client holds a controlling interest in the entity that owns it. The current lease runs through 2027. At that point, renewal terms are at the discretion of the controlling member." The room was very quiet. Derek looked at the document. Then he looked at me. This was the moment I had not anticipated feeling anything about. I had spent 4 years building something patient and quiet, and I had spent the last 6 months being told by my brother, in ways both direct and indirect, that I didn't understand the business, that I was being sentimental, that my father had always trusted him more, that I should take what was being offered and go back to Dayton. I looked at him across that glass table and I felt, not triumph exactly, something quieter than triumph. The feeling of having been right about your own value for a long time and finally having the room acknowledge it. "I'm not here to dissolve anything," I said. It was the first time I had spoken. "I'm not here to threaten the company. I built these assets because I believed in the business and I saw opportunities and I took them." "Just like Dad did," Derek said. "You did this without telling me. You made decisions without telling me," I said. "For 18 months, I kept records." His CFO leaned over and said something quietly in Derek's ear. Derek sat back. His lead attorney asked for a recess. We took a 40-minute break. Janet and I sat in a smaller room down the hall with terrible coffee, and she told me she thought they were going to come back with a different number. They came back with a different number. It was not the number I accepted. We went back and forth twice more before we reached an agreement. I will not state the final terms here because they are confidential, but I will say that I did not take a buyout and walk away. What I received was a restructured ownership agreement, a board seat, and a formal role as CFO with real authority. Authority that was now backed not just by equity but by the practical reality that I held a significant interest in the ground the company stood on. Derek and I have not had a personal conversation since that day that was not mediated by attorneys or filtered through formal correspondence. That is a loss. I want to be honest about that. Derek is my brother. I grew up with him. I have memories with him that have nothing to do with warehouses and leases and valuation documents. There is a version of this story where none of this happens, where my father lives longer, or where Derek makes different choices, or where I make different choices. But I have stopped spending energy on the version of the story that didn't happen. What happened is that I was told repeatedly by someone I loved and trusted that I didn't belong at the table, and instead of arguing or begging or performing grief loudly enough that someone might notice, I went home and I worked. I built things. I learned the angles he hadn't thought to consider because he had assumed, the whole time, that he was the only one thinking. I sat across from my brother in that conference room, and I did not have to say a single dramatic thing. I did not have to prove myself with words. The documents on the table said everything that needed to be said. My father used to tell me, when I was young, that the freight business was simple. You pick something up, you take it where it needs to go, you don't lose it along the way. I thought about that a lot, those 4 years. I picked something up. I took it where it needed to go, I didn't lose a thing.